Hello. Very pleased to be here today. Last thing standing between you and lunch, and I'm going to be talking about data about food. So I apologize for that. But actually, I think my presentation may follow pretty nicely from the previous one because I'll be talking about some of the retail scanner data that are available. This study was motivated by the fact that the Economic Research Service was starting to acquire scanner data from IRI and really needed to understand better what they were acquiring. Documentation is pretty limited. And so RTI as an organization has worked with ERS on a number of studies over the years, and they've asked us to come in and take a look at the data that they were beginning to acquire from IRI. Previously, we had done a similar study looking at data that they had started to acquire from Nielsen. And on here, I did want to indicate two products that were produced with the Economic Research Service that was based on our assessment of the IRI data, working closely with other researchers at ERS and with staff at RTI. So just for acknowledgement and disclaimers, most of what I'll be talking about was work that was done under an agreement with ERS, and I want to thank all of these collaborators at ERS, Megan Schweitzer, Abigail Grant, David Levin, as well as my RTI colleagues and former colleague now at University of Georgia, Chen Zhen, and also that all opinions, findings, and recommendations are not attributable to USDA, ERS, or IRI. So just to kind of get started on that, there's two primary sources of scanner data. This is really getting to some nitty-gritty about a particular data source that could be used to supplement other or blended with other data sources. There's store-based scanner data, which people are pretty familiar with because that's collected when you go to a store and the products are being scanned. That's store-based scanner data. But there's also a household panel that rescans and enters data on everything that they purchase every week. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And those data sets have different attributes in terms of their relevance for particular applications. So the advantages of scanner data, it's very high-frequency product price and purchase information at the detailed storekeeping unit level. So this could be a UPC code, that's the barcode that you see on products, or a price lookup code. Those are the little codes that are on little stickers on your produce. Or it could be at an individual household, individual store geographic area. So some of the considerations in using scanner data, cost of purchasing and obtaining a license to use the data, so that the ERS is putting a very large investment into buying these data every year. I think they've acquired about 8 years of data so far and have a new contract to continue acquiring it for another 5 years. Very limited availability of documentation on sampling, data collection, and weighting methods. So when ERS acquired the data, they got a data dictionary, little bits and pieces of written documentation, but no coherent story about how the data were being collected, how they were constructing weights, so a lot of information wasn't really available. And we had to work closely with, talking with IRI, having a lot of conversations with them to try to delve into all the details that ERS needed to be able to assess the quality of that data. So there's representativeness issues depending on how you're going to use the data, and then, of course, potential restrictions on release of analysis results, not being able to release any brand name information or store name information, so that can affect particular uses of the data. Some of the uses of the data for USDA's purposes are specifically to calculate the quarterly food at home price database. It's used to calculate the cost of the WIC food package and used to calculate the cost of the Thrifty Food Plan, which is the basis for the SNAP allotment. And I'm sure there are other uses, including at for the CPI construction. So we've talked about some of the importance of understanding the properties of the sample selection methods, data collection and processing methods, weighting methods, and comparing to other data sources. So I'll start by talking a little bit about the InfoScan data and then switch over. And if the data are coming from Nielsen, it's very comparable data, but they call it scan track instead. So they have a different name of the data product that they're producing. So what we began to understand when we start talking with IRI, which isn't apparent in any of their documentation, is that they have agreements with particular stores that provide all of their data to IRI, and then they sample a lot of other stores, smaller independent stores, in some cases actually going to the store and putting a scanner into the store. And that data are not available to anybody. So they will sell their data from their, what they call their census stores. And of course, it took us a long time to get over the fact that they don't mean census in the same way that all of us are used to thinking about census. When they say census, it means the store's going to provide has agreed to provide data from all of their stores. And so the sampled stores are not available at all. There's restrictions on some stores. A lot of stores have their own private label products, store brand products. Our estimate is that's probably around 17 or 18% of products sold in the United States are actually private label products. And sometimes they don't release the data at the same level of detail if it's private label, and some stores don't release it at all because that's very proprietary information to them in terms of how their store brands are doing relative to other chains. And then some retailers actually aggregate to what they call retailer marketing area rather than releasing at the individual store level. So when ERS acquires the data, it represents basically an unprojected or unweighted subset of the total IRI store data. So in having these discussions, we actually got a better understanding of what it is that they're actually acquiring. So the data set comprise on a per week basis a store ID, every single UPC code, the quantity sold, the value of the purchase, and then you can link that to characteristics about the store and the product. So thinking a bit more about the whole data collection process, they're receiving these sales, IRI is receiving sales data from these establishments have agreed to provide their data. They aggregate it to individual transactions at the UPC or product level code, and then IRI then takes it and aggregates it to a weekly level, and that's the data that are available through purchase agreements with them. So it includes mostly UPC-based products, barcode products, but a lot of products are sold random weight. They're either weighed at the store and labeled at the store, or they have a price lookup code and they're weighed at the store. So for some categories of food, that could be half of what's being sold. Fruits and vegetables is half of what's being sold are these random weight products, and you don't get the level of detail. And so that really affects what kind of analyses that can be done. And so most retailers report the total units sold and then the total dollars. In case of IRI, what they're having reported to them, the dollars are net of loyalty card discounts, but then the coupons and other discounts are recorded separately. So this shows you the store count for what IRI collects. We don't really know how it compares to Nielsen. The expectation is probably pretty similar. So you can see that there's about almost 60,000 stores that report UPC level, barcode level data in the United States, in the data that were acquired by ERS. Again, this skips all the sampled stores because that's not a product that can be purchased. And then for random weight products, it's almost 40,000. So there's a few categories here that aren't of much interest, particularly for ERS when you're looking at food. So the liquor category is not a particular concern, or the Defense Department category. So in some cases, that affects the level of the types of information that were provided in the data purchase. So we compare this to the store counts and census data. So this is attempting to match up how IRI describes the store category with the 5-digit NAICS code for that product, and going through the detail to try to align the store types as well as possible. And so looking at that it appears that about 40% of the stores in those particular NAICS codes are actually represented that are in census are actually in the IRI data that were acquired. That represents about 55% of sales overall. There's some oddities here in terms of about half of drugstores are included, but more than 100% of sales. We think that's probably due to some misalignment in how they categorize stores. What they may be calling a drugstore may be something else in the census data. So, and from our work at RTI, we don't have access to the detailed census records to be able to break it down. So we're matching as best as we can at the NAICS code level. And then another interesting thing is that they appear to have 150% of the mass merchandiser club stores that census has, but 80% of sales, which is probably reasonable. The sales is probably a reasonable approximation. Again, it could just be misclassification of stores. So when using the store-based scanner data, there's several considerations that would need to be taken into account, similar to using any other type of data source. So this data collection process is not designed to capture sales from smaller independent stores. The private label product data is not provided by all retailers. That could be a substantial underrepresentation. And then some of the aggregation of the data by the retailers prevents calculation of unit prices. And for random weight data, it becomes even trickier because it's only available for some stores. The product information is very limited. And then the final issue too is that so we've worked with scanner data also with the FDA, and when they acquire data from Nielsen, they buy projected data. In the case of ERS, the data that were purchased are not projected, and IRI will not release their projection factors or their weights when you're buying the individual store data. So this is a case where, like, the company is protecting its proprietary information and won't allow you to have weighted data along with the store-level detail that would allow you to sort of disaggregate the information. But in the case of ERS, they want that store-level detail. It's needed for a lot of the analyses that they do. So under a separate contract, RTI is actually working with ERS to develop projection factors or weights for the InfoScan data. And so we actually just got approval to use the Research Data Center at RTI's campus in North Carolina, and we're bringing in the InfoScan data, and we'll be doing address matching to develop control totals so that then we can develop weights for the InfoScan data that then can be made available to the research community that uses the data. So in that case, we're working to try to overcome one of the limitations that's imposed because of the confidentiality restrictions of IRI. And then switching over to household-based scanner data. So the household-based scanner data gives you a very different picture of food purchases because you can tie it to demographic information about a household. So there are 125,000 Brave households in the United States who are part of a panel that's jointly managed by IRI and Nielsen. They used to have separate panels. They merged them about 10 years ago. And so both companies maintain this national consumer panel. The households are recruited online, complete demographic information, and actually every week they record everything that they buy. They're given a handheld scanner or an app and record where they're buying the item. And then for the random weight, there's a random weight panel that I'll talk about in a minute. But their households agree to do this in exchange for actually some pretty small incentives. But they somehow enjoy this whole process of reporting all of their data. So in this case, IRI does provide projection factors that are developed through raking or iterative proportional fitting procedure. So the data set components has a purchase date, the household ID, the household that purchased the item, the store ID that's associated with that, the UPC code, the quantity, the price, the projection factor, and then that data can be linked to characteristics of the store household and the UPC level detail. So, these counts are for 2012. So for households that record UPCs, there were about 126,000 households. It's stayed relatively stable. I think now it's probably still pretty similar. And for the random weight panel, there are about 79,000. So if you look at the actual households that are considered the static panel, so here's an issue where IRI, and actually Nielsen does this as well, but they impose their own kind of data quality control on their panel. So they look at households in terms of whether or not they're reporting frequently enough and what their minimum average spending level is to decide whether or not they consider that a good enough household to include in their static panel. So IRI does actually release the data for both what they call their static panel, the panel that sort of meets their quality standards, and for the non-static panel, except that they don't assign a projection factor to the non-static part of the panel. But having access to both of those is very helpful in terms of assessing quality of the data that are provided. So when you look at those households that are good enough to be included in their static panel, it's about half of the panel. It's a little bit less for the random weight reporters because of the additional burden. But it's most of the transaction records, because the households that aren't making it into that static panel are the ones that are not reporting very frequently. So I guess to get into a little more detail about the data collection procedures, the household indicates the store where they're purchased. If it's a packaged product with a UPC, they just scan it with an app or a device that's given to them. And then they indicate if they received purchased that product on sale or received a deal. For random weight products, it's very burdensome because they have to look up a code first, enter it in, and then they record the total amount paid. They don't record the weight of the product, which becomes then an issue of how you use the data without the actual quantity. And then there's the issue of how IRI assigns a price. So first start working with scanner data, we assumed it's the price that the household is paying, and in fact, it's usually not. It's a price that's brought in from the store scanner data based on where that household shops. And so if they assign it at the price for the store chain in the market area, or IRI does this in its post-processing, or the average price for the store type in the marketing area. So if only in those cases where IRI does not have an agreement with that store to get scanner data does the household actually enter the price that they paid for the product. And so that factors into like how you actually interpret the data as you're using it for analyses. And then as a last resort, IRI will assign what they call a dictionary price that they have for all products. So for the weighting, so IRI, same as Nielsen, they use the same method to calculate projection factors using iterative proportional fitting. They have separate weights for the entire static panel and the random weight panel. They base that procedure on census demographic targets that they purchased from PopStats based on things like household size, age of household head, household income, ethnicity, race, presence of children, and county size. The projection factors are dynamic, which means that they recalculate them every year. So when people want to do analyses tracking households over a number of years, they have different projection factors over that set of years. Then we looked at some comparisons of average weekly household expenditures to other sources. So looking at it first, IRI is a percentage of the consumer expenditure survey, which probably you all are familiar with since it's a 2-week diary data collection in 18 broad categories. So we aligned the consumer network data with those 18 broad categories. We also looked at it in comparison to the Food App Survey, which was a survey that was conducted around 2011, 2012 by ERS. It represents about 5,000 households, everything they bought for a week. So we looked at these the household-based scanner data expenditures relative to those two sources, and found in general that the household-based scanner data is the percentage of sales or percentage of expenditures is substantially less than either of these two government data sources, even when the data are weighted using the projection factors. It's better for things like sugars and sweets, other dairy miscellaneous foods, things that mostly have barcodes. It gets worse when you get off to the right, where it's more products that are random weight. So this is an indication of some of the burden that's associated with the data collection. That means that they're not reporting as much of their expenditures. IRI does have a proprietary method that they use to account for underreporting in their the consumer network data. But again, that's proprietary information that can't be released to other parties. So some of the considerations in using the data, so the households that participate in this data collection are obviously not normal, or they're not typical of the U.S. population. I shouldn't say normal, but they tend to be more aware consumers. A few years ago, we actually did a survey where we asked the Nielsen panelists, which is now the same panelists, but we asked them some diet and health awareness questions that we obtained from government surveys, like from the NHANES survey, to see if their responses were similar to government surveys where you would think that it was a more representative respondent. And we found they're pretty much more aware of a lot of attributes about food and about health in general than the general population. Some of the households, a lot of types of households are less likely to meet qualifications for inclusion in the static panel. Those are the younger, well, they're harder to recruit, and then they don't report as well, I should say. It's sort of two levels of sort of losing that set of the population. Younger households under age 35, lower income households, Black and Hispanic households, and households with children. And we did compare sort of the raw estimates of their distribution to census targets, but that information, again, is proprietary, so although we saw the comparisons, we can't make that information public. And another issue then, as I've already talked about, is that the prices that are in the data are not actually the exact prices paid by the household. They're a reasonable approximation, but depending on the use, it could affect the information. And then finally, the way that the projection factors are calculated, it's based on demographics. It's not trying to match it up to shipment or expenditures data. That is something that IRI does when it's doing analyses for its own customers. So conclusions. So the data, these data in particular, as with many other commercial data sets, they're collected for commercial purpose. IRI is the government data. Selling their data for government or research purposes is a very small portion of their revenue stream. They're mostly in it to be able to sell analyses to their corporate clients. Not necessarily designed for research purposes. There's a lot of back-end processing that they do on their own when they're doing analyses for these companies. But their goals are, when they're working with a research organization or the government, is to hear an agreement with their stores regarding the level of disclosure. They count on stores to provide data to them, and so they don't want to cause a situation where a store is concerned about somebody releasing competitive information. They want to ensure the confidentiality of their household participants and of course, protect their competitive information. So at some point, you reach a limit about the information that they're willing to share, and IRI was extremely cooperative with us in sharing a lot of information about their data collection process, but at some point, it's how they generate how to make their money, so they kind of stop at a certain point where they feel like it would hinder their competitiveness. But in any case, when anyone's using these data, it's very important to understand the data collection and processing procedures and assess implications for results of analyses, both in terms of the characteristics of the stores and the households that participate, how all of the information is recorded, if the data are weighted, how they're actually calculating those weights. But then to try to end on a positive note, the level of granularity available in the data is uncomparable to really any other types of sources. There's lots of analyses that are being done at ERS and other organizations that just would not be feasible with any other type of data source, because it does allow you to get into so much depth regarding the information that's available.